This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 32 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, August 6, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. The committee in charge of arrangements for the annual reunion and Ladies' Day of the Cavalry Association are busy with plans for the day, and it is expected that it may prove as enjoyable to the members and their guests as last year. The dinner will be served at noon in the town hall, and the new Whitney Park will be in use for the first time. The battlefield and the ball field and the tennis court are nicely finished and available, while the remainder is not yet the beauty spot those interested expect it to become after a season or two when the grass and shrubbery are well growing. The Chelmsford Band will be in attendance during the day, and the hospitality of the membership will be extended to the guests of the occasion. Mr. and Mrs. John P. Wright, who have been enjoying a sojourn in the log cabin on the summit of Prospect Hill, have returned to their home with the expectation of coming again for 2 weeks a little later in the season. It was pleasant to have Walter Sleeper calling on old friends in his childhood home this week. Walter Sleeper's father of the same name was a doctor in Westford, and he died in 1908, and his mother had died in Westford in 1907 when Walter was just 12 years old. He also had 2 older sisters, so he was the youngest of the 3 children. Miss Elizabeth Hildreth of New York is making her usual summer sojourn with her cousin, Miss Ella Hildreth, at Prospect Hill Farm. That was on Lowell Road and near the Chelmsford end of it. Miss Emma Pelham is staying with Miss Miranda Luce. Miss Evelyn Hamlin has returned from a pleasant vacation spent at York Beach and at Worcester with her aunt, Miss Ellen Kimball. Miss Hannah Morrill has been the guest this week of her sister, Mrs. Orion V. Wells, the wife of Dr. Orion V. Wells. Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin F. Day have removed to Bedford to be with their son and family. Miss Nellie Gill of Waltham has been the guest of her cousin, Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher, and Wednesday, Mrs. Fletcher returned with Miss Gill for a few days' stay in Waltham. Augustus Bunce's many friends were sorry to know of his serious ill turn this week, but are glad he is able to be about again, superintending his farm interests. Gilmer Stone is also among the sick ones and under the doctor's care. Mr. and Mrs. Charles L. Hildreth and Master Roger Haywood Hildreth are enjoying a vacation at Wilton, New Hampshire. Charles O. Prescott has returned from an enjoyable trip of a week at Kineo, Maine on Moosehead Lake. Right in line with the spirit of village improvement, the enterprising firm of Wright and Fletcher have replaced the old sign over their store with a handsome new one with gilt letters on a background of black and underneath a smaller one reading, Post Office, Westford, Mass. The many Ottawists, who are oftentimes strangers passing through our main street, need not now be in doubt as to the identity of our present pretty village. That's the Wright and Fletcher store is where Muffins on Main is now located, and Ellen Hardy has placed a sign very similar to the one that's described here with the Wright and Fletcher name on it, him remembering the old store. The next couple of paragraphs is about a birthday party. The 14th birthday anniversary of Miss Hilda Isles on Friday of last week was made most memorable and enjoyable by a very pretty party given by her mother, Mrs. Florence Isles, for her daughter. A merry group of her friends were bidden for the evening, and much of the good time in games, music, and sociability were enjoyed in the barn, which had been prettily decorated for the occasion. The supper was served in the dining room indoors. The The color scheme of the supper table was pink and white and was very prettily arranged. The birthday cake had its place in honor in the center of the table. Caterer Fred A. Smith had charge of the making and serving of the ice cream. Miss Hilda was the recipient of many pretty gifts, and after a delightful evening, the happy company took their departure, wishing their young hostess many happy returns of the day. The next section is entitled Congregational. The bright, crisp weather last Sunday, after so much heat, was an ideal day for whatever plans one might have, particularly for the church going, and a large congregation was present at the Congregational Church, which was the only service in the village. Mr. Wallace's sermon was especially a message to the young people of the audience, and incidentally was of much interest to the older ones as well. He showed a very sympathetic and intelligent insight into many phases of youthful life with all its ambitions and temptations. For the next 3 Sundays, there will be no morning services during the pastor's vacation. Mr. Wallace went directly to Lunenburg, a former pastorate, and where he has so many friends, for a participation in the observance of an old home week, and where he had charge of the Sunday evening services. After several days at Lunenburg, Mr. and Mrs. Wallace go to Northfield for a series of meetings which are so valuable in the way of inspiration and helpfulness to Christian workers. Mrs. Pauline and Rachel Wallace will remain in Lunenburg while their parents are at Northfield. Next, we have the About Town section. During the thunder shower on Wednesday evening of last week, lightning came in contact with the lightning rod on the Unitarian Church, and they had it out together. The rod gave the lightning free transportation until near the ground, when the lightning suddenly scented something more to its liking, and without stopping to politely rap, it bolted right into the parlor and tried to play a tune on the pipe organ. The organ not being in tune, as the results of repairs on the church, it is not known what tune it did play. But as an organist, it was unsatisfactory, and the insurance company will have to be put on as an interpreter. The Talent Place, that's spelled Tallent, and that's a surname. The Talent Place on Stony Brook Road is being cleared of the disfigurement of the spring fire. The old shed, which the fire did not have time to finish on account of interference by the Westford Water Department, has been much improved in appearance by disappearance as a shed. The barn, which was shattered and tattered in the emergency engagement between fire and firemen, is being trimmed back to its former symmetry. Last Thursday afternoon of last week, Paul Quist, who was tool sharpener for H.E. Fletcher Company, while sharpening tools, had a piece of hot steel fly and lodge in the eye. He was quickly removed to the office of Dr. Leary of Lowell, who pronounced it painful and placed him under expert treatment to prevent loss of sight seeing from the right side. That almost absolutely, it says that almost absolute, but I think he means that almost obsolete old-fashioned New England yoke of oxen was seen Monday afternoon with all the cud-chewing simplicity of ye olden days as they passed through town on the Lowell Road for the Levi T. Fletcher farm, where the Burton H. Wiggin Company of Lowell is hauling wood and loading it on the cars at Brookside. With windows closed, curtains drawn, doors that open not, whistle that soundeth not, and waterfall that carries no energy to the wheel, the Brookside Mill, like a parade, has been ordered to the at-rest position. It looks at present as though the town would be compelled to be defendant in a suit for damages as the result of death by accident on the highway of the late Charles Reed. If the suit comes to trial, it will be held in the United States Court at Boston. This will allow the jury to be drawn from any part of the state. The trial, if pressed, will come off in October. Mr. and Mrs. George Howard Jr. left the old Oaken Bucket Farm last week for Brown Brook, New Jersey. They left Boston Harbor on the boat Harvard. When a short way out of the harbor, the boat was struck by lightning. After striking the boat, the lightning struck the water and was drowned. Sounds like a lot of electrical storms in the area this week. Miss Amy Schellinger and Miss Holt of Boston were recent visitors at the farm on Lowell Road, where the lawn tennis court, the old Oaken Bucket, and the forest shades of Francis Hill are nature's wayside inn. This, of course, is the town of the author, Samuel L. Taylor, author of the About Town section. The town teams are busy hauling gravel from the Willard Fletcher Bridge on the Stony Brook Road to Main Street near Chamberlain's Corner. Charles A. Prescott, the 2-month-old child of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Prescott, was buried in Fairview Cemetery Monday afternoon. Services were held at the grave by Reverend David Wallace. Next, we have the Forge Village section. The members of the John Edwards Hose Company held a very enjoyable dance in Abbott Hall Saturday evening. A large number from out of town were present. Gilmore's Orchestra of Lowell furnished the music, and refreshments were served at intermission. Joseph Bennett Jr. acted as general manager, assisted by members of the Hose Company. About $18 were turned into the treasury. Mr. and Mrs. Anthony H. Fernald of College City, California, are rejoicing in the birth of a son born on July 17th, who has been named Anthony H. Jr. Mr. Fernald was a prominent member of St. Andrew's Mission and is the son of Mr. and Mrs. William H. Fernald of Knops Pond Farm in Groton. Mr. Fernald was ordered south by his physician 2 years ago, but since his residence in California has enjoyed the best of health. Miss Catherine Burgess of Lowell is visiting at the Fisher Cottage, the Birches. That would be on Forge Pond. Mr. and Mrs. Bailey of Everett, who are enjoying a camp life at Forge Pond for the month of August, are entertaining Miss Carol Combs of New York City. Mr. and Mrs. Freeman of Everett are occupying a cottage for the month of August at the pond. Mr. Otis and party of friends from Boston are at Idlewood for a 2 weeks outing. That's another cottage on Forge Pond. Mr. Titcomb, with friends from Nashua, will spend the next 2 weeks at Pine Camp, another cottage on Forge Pond. The G.W. Proudies of Littleton broke camp Monday after spending 2 weeks at Forge Pond. They were succeeded by the J.W. Irelands and family of Littleton, who will enjoy the cool breezes of the pond for 2 weeks. Mr. and Mrs. Small of Everett are entertaining Master Everett and Miss Elizabeth Wakeman of Everett and Miss Frida Klingerhagen of Quincy at their cottage. J.W. Blake and John Traynor, who have been employed the past few months on the new Abbott Mill, left here Monday for Rotterdam, New York, where they are to assist in the construction of the new YMCA building, which is being erected there. The many friends and former parishioners of Reverend Thomas L. Fisher will be interested to learn that he has decided to go to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where he will engage in missionary work for 1 year. If at the end of that time he finds his work pleasing, Mrs. Fisher and 2 children will join him. Mr. Fisher received the call to South Dakota over a year ago, but did not care to go so far from his mother, who is 83 years old. He will commence his new duties September 1st. Reverend Fisher was the pastor of St. Andrew's Church in Ayer and also of St. Andrew's Mission, a mission church of the church in Ayer, located in Forge Village. Miss Ada Newt, N-U-T-E, of Brockton, is visiting with Mrs. H.E. Randall. Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson have as their guests Mr. and Mrs. Frank Gardes, G-A-R-D-E-S, Miss Mamie Dando, and Miss Mildred McDonald of South Boston, and Frank Sullivan of Nashua, New Hampshire. Walter Chappell, the well-known teamster for Abbott and Company, resigned his position Wednesday and starts Sunday for Winnipeg, Manitoba, where he will assist in harvesting the great wheat crop. His cousin, Alexander Chappell, will accompany him. Charles Blodgett of the Ridges has accepted the position as teamster for the Abbott Company. A son, Adment, A-D-M-E-N-T, was born Thursday, July 28th to Mr. and Mrs. Eugene Delorier. Well, it says Delorier, but I think the last surname is DeLuin, D-E-L-O-U-I-N. Mr. and Mrs. John Pauquette of Nashua, New Hampshire, who are spending this week at her parents', Mr. and Mrs. Felix Leclerc, are rejoicing in the birth of a son, Thomas A., born Wednesday, August 3rd. At the regular meeting of the John Edwards Hose Company Wednesday evening, Matthew Elliott was elected to fill the vacancy caused by the resignation of Walter Chappell. The resignation of Captain Richard Prescott was received and regretfully accepted to take effect September 1st. John Spinner Jr. was nominated. Miss Ethel Collins, the 8-year-old daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Miles Collins, underwent a successful operation at her home Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Orion V. Wells, performed the operation, assisted by Mrs. Wells as trained nurse. The little patient is doing well. Services at St. Andrew's Mission will be held at 9 o'clock. Holy Communion will be celebrated. Reverend Harry Gray will conduct the service. The usual afternoon devotions will be admitted. Miss Alice H. Schicks and Miss Louise M. Marinell and party of friends of Lowell have returned home after a pleasant vacation spent at Mr. Lowther's cottage on the shore of Forge Pond. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending August 6th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.